In the winter of 1836, the sea off the coast of Portland, Maine, was a creature of gray moods and sudden violence. It was a place of unforgiving granite shores and churning, slate-colored water that could steal the heat from a man's body in minutes. Upon a lonely islet of rock, known as Greyhaven, a stone lighthouse stood against the endless assault of the Atlantic. It was a vital beacon, a promise of safety for ships navigating the treacherous shoals. Its light was meant to be as constant as the tides themselves. But in early December of that year, the light went out. The first reports were scattered, dismissed as tricks of fog or the tired eyes of sailors. A merchant vessel, the Sea Serpent, noted in its log on December the 3rd that the Greyhaven light seemed weak, sputtering against the gloom. 2 days later, a fishing boat returning to harbor reported seeing nothing at all where the powerful beam should have been. By the 7th of the month, a full week after the last confirmed sighting of its lamp, a consensus of fear settled over the port. The tower stood dark. The harbor master was a man named Elias Brewer, a captain of some 40 years whose face was a testament to a life spent squinting into sun and sea spray. He was not a man given to flights of fancy. A dark lighthouse meant one of two things: a catastrophic failure of the lamp mechanism or a terrible misfortune befalling its keeper. The keeper was Edwin Mallory, a reliable man who had tended the light for 3 years with his wife Catherine and their 2 young children, Jonathan and Emily. They were known to be a quiet, resilient family, well suited to the profound isolation of their post. On the morning of December the 9th, under a sky the color of lead, Captain Brewer assembled a small search party. He chose 4 men, all experienced sailors who knew the currents around Greyhaven. Their mood was somber as they loaded the launch. The wind was sharp, carrying the threat of snow, and the sea was restless. As they cast off, the silence among them was heavier than the damp, cold air. Every man knew the possible horrors that awaited them: a slip on the wet rocks, a sudden illness with no doctor to call, a fire, or worse, the simple, crushing madness that island isolation was known to breed. The journey to Greyhaven took nearly 2 hours. The islet rose from the sea like the jagged spine of some drowned beast. As they drew closer, the lighthouse resolved itself from the mist, a stark, pale column against the dark rock. There was no smoke rising from the chimney of the attached keeper's quarters. There was no sign of life on the narrow shore. The place looked not just empty, but abandoned, as if it had been uninhabited for a generation rather than a week. Brewer's deposition to the Port Authority, dated December the 21st, 1836, provides a clear, chilling account of what they found. The document itself, now held in the state archives, is written in a steady hand, but the formality of the language cannot entirely conceal the deep unease of its author. An excerpt from the deposition of Captain Elias Brewer reads, "Upon making our approach to the Greyhaven Islet, we observed no damage to the exterior of the lighthouse tower or the adjoining dwelling. The sea was high, but not dangerously so. We sounded our horn twice upon approach, but received no answer. The silence of the place was the first thing that struck me as unnatural. Even the gulls, which are ever present on those rocks, were absent. There was only the sound of the wind and the water breaking upon the shore." Mooring the boat was difficult. The small wooden jetty had been battered by a recent storm, and a thick layer of slick, black algae coated every surface. 2 of Brewer's men had to leap onto the rocks with the ropes, their boots slipping precariously close to the churning surf. Once ashore, the men stood for a long moment, staring up at the silent tower. The air was heavy with the smell of brine and cold stone. Brewer led the way, his hand resting on the hilt of a small utility knife at his belt, a habit born of caution. The main door to the keeper's house, a heavy oak construction meant to withstand Atlantic gales, was not locked. It was not even latched. It swung inward with a low groan at Brewer's touch, revealing the darkness within. A wave of cold, stagnant air washed over them. It was a profound, biting cold, the kind that settles into a place where no fire has burned for many days. The deposition continues. "I found the main entrance unbarred. This was the second unnatural thing. Keeper Mallory was a meticulous man. He understood the necessity of securing his post against the elements. For his door to be left open to the sea air suggested either great haste or a profound neglect of duty, neither of which was in his character. I ordered my men to proceed with caution and to touch nothing until we had assessed the situation. They stepped inside. The first room served as a kitchen and living area. It was here that the scene of quiet dread truly began to unfold. A single whale oil lantern sat on the center of a simple wooden table, its flame burning so low it was nearly extinguished. It cast a weak, flickering yellow light, creating long, dancing shadows that seemed to hide in the corners of the room. On the table, 4 plates of food sat untouched. There was salted fish and hardened biscuit, the meal cold and congealed. 4 chairs were arranged around the table, one of them slightly pushed back, as if its occupant had just stood up. A woman's woolen shawl was draped over the back of that chair. Brewer walked slowly around the room. The fire in the hearth was a mound of gray, lifeless ash. A stack of children's books sat on a small shelf, their spines neat and orderly. A sewing basket rested on a stool by the fireplace. A needle still threaded through a piece of linen, mending a child's sock. Everything was in its place, yet the profound sense of wrongness was suffocating. This was not the scene of a struggle or a violent intrusion. It was a scene of sudden, inexplicable departure. It was as if the Mallory family had simply vanished in the middle of their evening meal. One of Brewer's men, a young sailor named Thomas, pointed to the floor near the hearth. A small cloth doll lay face down on the stone flags. It was the kind of simple toy a child might carry everywhere, the kind they would never leave behind willingly. Brewer bent down and picked it up. It was cold to the touch. From his deposition, in the main living quarters, a meal for 4 was laid upon the table. The food had not been consumed. A lantern was lit, though its oil was nearly spent. I estimated from the state of the food and the cold in the hearth that the dwelling had been empty for no less than a week, and perhaps longer. There were no signs of a struggle. No furniture was overturned. Nothing was stolen. It was as if the family had been called away from their supper by some urgent matter and had simply failed to return. Brewer directed 2 men to search the upper levels of the living quarters while he and Thomas examined the rest of the ground floor. They found the larder, stocked with salted meats, barrels of flour, and casks of water. There were enough provisions to last through the winter. Whatever had happened to the Mallorys, it was not starvation. The storage rooms were tidy, the coils of rope and barrels of lamp oil all in their designated places. Edwin Mallory, it was clear, had been an excellent keeper. A shout came from upstairs. Brewer and Thomas mounted the narrow wooden staircase, their boots echoing in the stillness. The 2 bedrooms were on the 2nd floor. The first, belonging to Edwin and Catherine, was as orderly as the rooms below. The bed was neatly made, a thick quilt pulled up to the pillows. A well-worn Bible sat on a small nightstand, a ribbon marking a passage in the Book of Psalms. A sea chest at the foot of the bed was closed and locked. It was a room of quiet, domestic peace, made terrifying by its emptiness. The 2nd bedroom was for the children, Jonathan and Emily. It was smaller, with 2 narrow cots against the far wall, and it was here that the first truly bizarre piece of evidence was found. One of Brewer's men stood in the center of the room, his face pale in the dim light from the hallway. He pointed to the wall beside Jonathan's bed. Brewer stepped closer. Scratched into the plaster were a series of strange, unsettling symbols. They were not letters, nor were they drawings of ships or fish as a young boy might make. They were complex, geometric patterns, full of sharp angles and interlocking spirals. They seemed to follow no discernible logic, yet they were carved with a desperate, repetitive force. The plaster was gouged so deeply that the dark lath beneath was visible, and on the floor, directly below the markings, were small, dried flecks of brown and red. From the deposition, in the children's sleeping quarters, we discovered a series of markings etched into the wall beside the male child's cot. The patterns were of a strange and disturbing nature, unlike any alphabet or symbol I have ever witnessed. Upon closer inspection of the floor beneath these carvings, I observed what appeared to be dried blood, as well as several broken fingernails. It is my belief that the boy, Jonathan Mallory, made these marks himself, using his own hands, until his fingers bled. A deep, primal chill settled over Brewer, colder than the winter air. He was a man of the sea. He had seen death in many forms. He had seen the aftermath of storms and the grim results of shipwrecks. But this was different. This was a quiet, creeping horror that had no name. He stared at the symbols on the wall, and for a moment he felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, as if he were looking at something man was not meant to see. Leaving the men to finish their search of the living quarters, Brewer proceeded alone into the base of the lighthouse tower itself. The air grew colder still, the smell of damp stone and salt more intense. He began the long, winding ascent up the cast-iron spiral staircase. His footsteps rang out in the confined space, the only sound besides the faint, mournful howl of the wind outside. He climbed past landing after landing, the small, thick glass windows offering only glimpses of the churning gray sea below. He finally reached the lantern room at the very top. It was a space of mechanical precision. The great Fresnel lens, a masterpiece of glass and brass, stood immaculate. It was clean, polished, and perfectly aligned. The clockwork mechanism that rotated the lamp was wound and in perfect working order. The reservoirs were full of high-quality whale oil. Everything was ready. The lamp had not failed. It had simply not been lit. This, for Brewer, was the most damning evidence of all. A lighthouse keeper's duty was sacred. To fail to light the lamp was the gravest sin a keeper could commit. It meant ships could be wrecked and lives could be lost. Edwin Mallory would have sooner cut off his own hand than neglect his duty. Whatever had happened on this island, it had been powerful enough to make a good man abandon his post, abandon his family, and let his light go out. Brewer descended the stairs slowly, his mind reeling. Nothing made sense. No storm could account for a family disappearing from inside a locked house. No sickness could explain the strange symbols scratched into the wall. No pirate or marauder would have left behind valuable supplies and provoked no struggle. He returned to the main living area. His men had found nothing else of consequence. The house was a perfect, preserved portrait of a family life that had abruptly ceased to exist. As he stood by the table, his gaze fell upon the keeper's desk in the corner. It was a small, functional piece of furniture, its surface neat except for one item. It was the official Greyhaven Lighthouse logbook. It was bound in thick, dark leather, and it was open. A quill pen lay beside it, its nib slightly askew, as if dropped in a hurry. The page was covered in handwriting. Brewer leaned closer. The entries at the top of the page were written in Edwin Mallory's familiar, precise script. They were records of weather, wind direction, and passing ships. But as Brewer's eyes traveled down the page, the writing became erratic. The lines slanted, the letters misshapen and desperate. It was the writing of a man whose hand was shaking uncontrollably, the writing of a man losing his grip on sanity. Brewer did not read the final entry then. He noted it was there, a frantic scrawl at the bottom of the page, the ink blotted and faded in one corner, as if a tear had fallen upon it. He knew this book was the only real evidence they had. It was the only voice left to tell the story of what had happened to the Mallory family. From the final section of his deposition, I have recovered the keeper's logbook, which I have submitted to the Port Authority as the sole piece of evidence retrieved from the site. I cannot speculate as to the fate of Keeper Mallory, his wife, or his children. I can only state for the record what I observed. A home abandoned in haste, but without violence. A larder full of provisions. A child's toy left on the floor. Unnatural markings on a bedroom wall. And a perfectly functional lamp that had been left to go dark. We left the islet as dusk began to fall. As we sailed away, the dark tower of Greyhaven stood against the winter sky. I did not look back. I do not intend to ever return. Captain Brewer and his men returned to Portland that evening, the logbook wrapped carefully in oilcloth. As they entered the harbor, the warm lights of the city seemed a world away from the cold, silent rock they had just left behind. The mystery of the Mallory family had begun. The dark tower they left behind held its secrets. and the only key was a book filled with a good man's descent into madness, its final pages waiting to be read. In the cold, salt-scrubbed office of the Portland harbor master, the Greyhaven logbook sat upon Captain Brewer's desk like an accusation. It was a heavy, ledger-sized volume, bound in black leather that was stiff and warped from years of exposure to the damp sea air. Its pages, thick and fibrous, smelled of mildew, whale oil, and the faint, lingering scent of the cold, empty house from which it had been taken. For days after its retrieval, the book remained the focal point of a quiet, grim investigation. It was the only witness, the only voice that could speak for the vanished Mallory family. The initial examination was conducted by Captain Brewer himself, along with a clerk from the Port Authority, a man named Silas Croft, whose neat, meticulous nature was perfectly suited to the task. They handled the book with a reverence usually reserved for Scripture. They saw it not merely as a record of weather and tides, but as the final testament of a man they had known and respected. The early entries, dating from the late summer of 1836, were exactly what one would expect from a keeper like Edwin Mallory. His script was a model of clarity and economy. Each entry was a testament to his methodical mind and his dedication to his duty. An entry from September the 5th reads, "Wind southwesterly, 5 knots, sea calm, visibility clear to the horizon, polished the lens reflectors and trimmed all wicks, refilled main oil reservoir, all in good order. Sighted the schooner Good Fortune at midday, heading north. Catherine and the children gathered mussels on the low tide rocks. A peaceful day." The entries for September and most of October follow this same predictable, comforting rhythm. They paint a picture of a life that was isolated but not unhappy. Mallory notes the changing colors of the autumn sky, the successful mending of a sailcloth tarp, his son Jonathan's excitement at seeing a pod of whales, and his daughter Emily's delight in a new doll sewn by her mother. These were the chronicles of a family making a home in one of the loneliest places on earth. There is no hint of fear, no trace of the horror to come. The ink is a steady, confident black, the lines perfectly parallel. The first deviation from this routine appears on the 28th of October. It is subtle, easily missed by a casual reader, but to Brewer, who knew the sea and the men who worked it, the change in tone was unmistakable. The entry for that day begins as usual, with a report on the weather, a brewing storm from the northeast. But then a new observation is added, one that has nothing to do with the duties of a lighthouse keeper. October 28th. A peculiar sound from the surf tonight, even with the rising storm. Not the usual crash and roar of the waves against the rock. It is a lower, more resonant tone, a vibration almost. Felt it in the stones of the tower. I am certain it is merely the pressure of the deep water swells against the foundation of the islet. The sea has many voices, and a man in a place like this can begin to imagine things. He was already trying to explain it away. That, to Brewer, was the first sign of trouble. A sailor does not question the sounds of the sea unless the sounds themselves are questionable. For the next several days, there is no further mention of the sound. Mallory's entries return to descriptions of the storm, which was a fierce one, lashing Greyhaven with wind and rain for nearly 4 days. He writes of securing the shutters, of the comfort of the fire in the hearth, of his family safe inside while the Atlantic raged without. Then, on November the 3rd, after the storm has passed, the strangeness returns, but this time it is inside the house. November 3rd. The sea is calm again, but the air is heavy. Catherine has been restless these past few nights. I found her walking in the main room long after the children were asleep. She stood at the window facing the sea. She claimed she was listening to the quiet, but her expression was one I did not recognize. When I took her hand, it was as cold as winter stone. The isolation wears on her more than she admits. This entry is significant. The handwriting is still steady, but the subject matter has shifted from the external world of the lighthouse to the internal world of his family. Over the next week, his personal notes become more frequent, small asides tucked between reports of ship traffic and oil consumption. He writes of Catherine's silences, of her humming strange, tuneless melodies while mending clothes. He mentions that she has lost her appetite. By mid-November, the focus of his concern shifts to his son, Jonathan. November 14th. Jonathan has grown quiet. He no longer asks to help me with the lamp. He spends his hours at the northern window of the children's room, the one that looks out over the whispering shoals. He watches the water. Today I asked him what he was looking at. He said, "They are calling." I asked who was calling. He would not answer. He only pointed to the water. I saw nothing but the tide pulling at the kelp. The next day's entry contains the first mention of the scratches. November 15th. A terrible discovery. I found marks on the plaster wall beside Jonathan's bed. Deep, angry gouges. At first I thought he had found a piece of metal, but then I looked at his hands. His fingernails are torn, the tips raw and bloody. He made the marks himself. When I asked him why, he began to weep, but he would not say a word. Catherine held him, but even she could not soothe him. The symbols he scratched, they are like nothing I have ever seen. They seem to twist the eye when you look at them. Here, for the first time, Mallory's handwriting begins to falter. The letters become slightly larger, the pressure of the quill on the page heavier, as if he is gripping it with white-knuckled force. The disciplined keeper is giving way to the terrified father. Silas Croft, the clerk, had to put on his spectacles and lean close to the page, tracing the words with a trembling finger. The entries for the third week of November are a chilling chronicle of a family coming undone. The logbook, meant to be an objective record for the lighthouse service, becomes a desperate private diary. November 18th. The sound is constant now. It is not just in the rock. It rises from the sea itself, a discordant song that seems to come from all directions at once. At night, it feels as if it is inside the very walls of the house. I am the only one who seems to find it disturbing. Catherine says it is beautiful. She hums along with it now. It is the same tuneless melody as before. November 20th. Catherine spoke in her sleep last night. But it was not her voice. It was deeper, guttural. And the words were not English, nor any language I know. It sounded like a series of clicks and long, drawn-out groans. I shook her awake, and she looked at me with no recognition in her eyes. Then she blinked, and she was herself again, asking me why I had woken her. She remembered nothing. November 22nd. Jonathan will not stop scratching. I have had to bind his hands in cloth at night. He cries in his sleep. Emily, my poor, sweet Emily, hides beneath her covers and will not come out. She says she is afraid of the songs Jonathan sings. I have not heard him sing. When I asked him, he said the songs were for the ones below. The methodical reports on weather and ships are now mere footnotes, scrawled hastily at the top of the page. The bulk of each entry is a frantic, terrified account of the psychological siege upon his family. The ink is often smudged, and in one place, a dark, circular stain has bled through the page. Brewer and Croft stared at it, a silent, unspoken question hanging in the air between them. Was it seawater or a tear? The final week of entries is where the keeper's practice prose collapses entirely into the fragmented thoughts of a man on the edge of madness. The handwriting is almost illegible, a frantic scrawl that slants violently across the page. November 26th. They want in. The voices from the water are louder. They call our names, Edwin, Catherine, Jonathan, Emily. They know our names. How can they know our names? I barred the door, but the sound comes through the stone. November 27th. I saw a face in the waves today, just for a second. It was not human. It was pale and wide, with eyes like polished stones. I must be going mad. It is the isolation. It is the wind. It has to be. November 29th. Catherine opened the door last night. I found her standing on the rocks, just at the edge of the water. The tide was coming in. She was speaking to the surf, using that other voice. I had to drag her back inside. She fought me. She has never been so strong. She said I was keeping her from her real family. November 30th. Jonathan has chewed through his bindings. There are new marks on the wall, And this time, he used his own blood to trace them. They are the same symbols. They are everywhere now. I see them when I close my eyes. The sea is not the sea. It is something else. It is a door, and it is opening. After the entry for November 30th, there is a stark, terrifying change in the logbook. The next page is not filled with words. It is covered, from top to bottom, in the same complex, angular symbols that Jonathan had scratched into the wall. They are drawn in the same dark ink as the rest of the log, but with a frenzied, overlapping intensity. It is not the careful geometry of a boy's carving. It is the frantic repetition of a mind that has been completely overwhelmed. It is impossible to tell if this was Edwin Mallory trying to copy what his son had made, or if he was now drawing the symbols from his own shattered memory. This page of symbols is the last coherent thing in the Greyhaven logbook for several days. It is followed by 3 pages that have been left completely blank. Then there is the final, brief, and almost unreadable entry that Captain Brewer had noted upon his initial discovery. But as Silas Croft carefully turned the page of symbols, he made a discovery that caused him to let out a small, sharp gasp. Between the page of symbols and the first blank page, a single page had been torn from the book. It was not a clean tear. A ragged, narrow strip of paper remained, caught in the book's binding. It was clear the page had been ripped out with desperate force. There was a story on that missing page, a story that took place between the father's descent into replicating the symbols and his final cryptic message. Whatever had happened on that day, whatever event had been so terrible or so final, Edwin Mallory had felt the need to record it. And then, either he or someone else had decided it was a truth too monstrous to be left behind. The investigation in the harbor master's office came to a halt. The men stared at the ragged stub of paper, at the violent, empty space in the heart of the record. The silence in the room was absolute. Outside, the sounds of the busy port seemed a world away. The mystery of the Greyhaven lighthouse had just deepened. A missing family was a tragedy. A missing page was evidence of a secret. The investigation into the disappearance of the Mallory family reached a standstill in the early months of 1837. Edwin Mallory's logbook offered a terrifying narrative, but it was a closed loop, the testimony of a single mind spiraling into darkness. It raised far more questions than it answered. The official conclusion, recorded with weary resignation by the port authorities, was lost at sea, presumed deceased. The strange symbols, the untouched meal, the keeper's final, frantic words, these were filed away as the sad artifacts of a tragedy exacerbated by extreme isolation and mental decline. The sea, it was decided, had simply taken them, but the historical record is often a patchwork, with crucial pieces of evidence emerging long after the official narrative has been sealed. So it was with the Greyhaven case. In April of that year, nearly 5 months after the family vanished, a woman named Eleanor Vance presented herself to the harbor master in Portland. She was Catherine Mallory's younger sister, a resident of Boston who had only just learned of the tragedy through a belatedly delivered letter from a mutual acquaintance. She brought with her a small, oilskin-wrapped bundle tied with twine. Inside was a collection of letters from her sister, the last correspondence she had ever received from Greyhaven. The bundle was damp, and the letters within were tragically damaged. They had been sent with a supply boat captain who, waylaid by winter storms and personal matters, had failed to post them from the mainland for many weeks. By the time they reached Eleanor, the ink on many of the pages had bled, and dark water stains bloomed across Catherine's elegant script. These letters, though fragmented and incomplete, provide a second, more intimate narrative of the final months at the lighthouse. They are a wife's testimony, a mother's fears, and they do not speak of madness. They speak of a creeping, external influence, a presence that laid siege to her home and her family, not from within, but from the gray, endless water that surrounded them. The early letters, dated from late August and September, echo the peaceful domesticity of Edwin's log. Catherine writes of the beauty of the island, a stark and lonely place that she was determined to make into a home. A letter dated September the 12th. mostly intact, reads, "My dearest Eleanor, the air here is so clean it feels as though you are breathing in the sky itself. Edwin is a fine keeper, so diligent in his duties. He polishes the great lens until it shines like a captured star. Jonathan has become a true island boy, and his face and hands are perpetually stained with salt and adventure. Little Emily has appointed herself the queen of the tide pools and rules over her kingdom of snails and crabs with a gentle hand. The loneliness is a challenge, I admit. At night, the darkness is so complete it feels like a physical thing. But the light from our tower cuts through it, and I feel safe. We are a world unto ourselves, and for now, it is a happy one." Her tone is one of resolute optimism. She describes teaching the children their letters, mending Edwin's heavy wool coats, and the simple joy of watching the ships pass on the horizon, imagining the lives of those aboard. She mentions the sea often, but always with a sense of wonder and respect. It is a powerful neighbor, a source of beauty and sustenance. The change begins in a letter from late October. The paper is badly water damaged near the bottom, and several key sentences are lost to time and dampness. But what remains is chilling. October the 30th. A great storm has just passed, and the world feels washed clean. But something has changed, Eleanor. There is a sound now, one that was not here before. Edwin says it is just the tide settling, but it is not. It is a song, a low, deep music that seems to rise from the very bedrock of this place. I hear it most clearly at night, when the wind dies down. It is, I do not have the words. It is not frightening, not yet. It is compelling. It makes me feel a strange sort of sadness, a longing for something I cannot name. The next few lines are a blur of washed-out ink. The legible text picks up again, the handwriting slightly less steady. Wakes me from my sleep. I find myself at the window, looking out at the water. The waves seem to move in time with the song. Is it possible for a place to have a voice? Edwin worries. He sees the dark circles under my eyes. I have tried to describe it to him, but he looks at me with such concern that I have resolved to speak of it no more. He believes the isolation is affecting my nerves. Perhaps he is right, but the music is still there. This is a critical divergence from her husband's log. Edwin recorded his wife's strange behavior, her midnight wanderings, and her humming. He interpreted it all as a symptom of psychological distress. Catherine's letter, however, describes it as a response to an external stimulus, a song that only she could truly hear. She was not losing her mind. She felt she was being communicated with. The next surviving letter is dated November the 17th. The handwriting has become noticeably more hurried, the letters smaller and more cramped, as if she were trying to write down her thoughts before they escaped her. The paper is brittle, and a large portion of the right side is torn away. Eleanor, I am so frightened. The song is no longer just a sound. It is a presence. I feel it all the time now. It is a pull, a constant pull towards the shore. It whispers in my dreams, words I do not know, in a language that feels older than memory. I wake with these words on my lips, the taste of salt in my mouth. Edwin heard me one night, and the fear in his eyes? He thinks I am ill. He thinks my mind is breaking. The torn edge of the page cuts the sentence off. The text on the back of the fragment continues. Not just me anymore. It has turned its attention to Jonathan. He stands at his window for hours, staring at the shoals. He does not play. He does not speak to us. He only watches. Yesterday he told me that the mothers in the water were singing to him. He said they were lonely. When I touched his forehead, his skin was as cold as the spray from the rocks. And then there are the things he has been scratching on the wall. Edwin was horrified, but Eleanor, I have seen them before, in my dreams. They are the shapes of the words in the song. This revelation is staggering. According to Edwin's log, the symbols first appeared as a terrifying, inexplicable creation of his son. But Catherine's letter suggests that she was the original recipient of this dark knowledge, and that Jonathan was merely giving it physical form. The influence had touched her first, then moved on to her more impressionable child. The final letter in the bundle is barely a letter at all. It is a single sheet of paper, dated only the last week of November. It is horribly stained, the ink smeared in long, watery streaks. It appears to have been written in great haste, and perhaps in great fear. Only a few phrases and sentences are legible, islands of text in a sea of blurred ink. Cannot keep them out. The stone is no barrier. The children's eyes. They are not their own. Edwin tries to fight it. He reads his Bible, he bars the door, but it is already inside. It came in with the damp. It came in with the sound. He thinks we are his family. Not the sea. It is a cradle, waiting. Wants us back. The final legible words on the page are a desperate, smeared plea. Eleanor, burn this. This was the last piece of writing from Catherine Mallory, but it was not the last thing her sister received. When Eleanor Vance presented the bundle of letters to Captain Brewer, she also recounted the manner of their arrival. The supply boat captain had delivered them to her home in Boston, bundled with a small, heavy object wrapped in sailcloth. He said a quiet, somber man, the lighthouse keeper, had given him the package on his last supply run in late October and paid him extra to ensure it reached his sister-in-law. Inside the sailcloth, Eleanor had found a small, smooth, dark stone, the kind worn by the sea for centuries. It was unremarkable, except for one thing. Etched into its surface, with crude, sharp lines, was one of the very same symbols that Jonathan had been scratching into the lighthouse wall. Eleanor Vance's testimony, recorded by Silas Croft, states, "The captain told me that when Keeper Mallory gave him the package, he looked pale and distracted. He said only, 'Give this to Eleanor. Tell her it is a key. She will know what it is for when the time comes.' I did not understand. I still do not. The stone feels wrong. It is cold, colder than it should be, and sometimes, when I hold it, I think I can hear a faint, distant singing. I have kept it locked in a box ever since." The existence of the stone, carved and sent weeks before Jonathan Mallory began his frantic carvings, shattered the official theory of the family's decline. This was not a case of shared madness born of isolation. It was evidence of a premonition. Edwin Mallory, the rational, dutiful keeper, had known something was wrong long before he began documenting his family's descent in his log. He had tried to send a warning, a cryptic message in a language he himself did not seem to understand. The fragmented letters of his wife and the strange, cold stone he had sent to her sister formed a terrible harmony. They told a story not of a family that had lost its way, but of a family that had been found by something else, something ancient, patient, and hungry, that sang to them from the deep. The logbook had been a record of the symptoms. Catherine's letters were a testament from the heart of the sickness itself, and the torn-out page in Edwin's log now loomed larger than ever, a silent testament to a day when the singing from the sea was finally answered from within the stone walls of Greyhaven Light. The accounts of Edwin and Catherine Mallory provided a framework of terror, a duet of parental fear and creeping dread. But the true heart of the Greyhaven tragedy lies with the two smallest victims, Jonathan and Emily. They were not merely witnesses to their parents' ordeal. They were central figures in the unfolding horror. To understand what happened at the lighthouse, one must look past the adult narratives and into the silent spaces where the children's experiences reside. The evidence is scarce, found not in coherent letters or detailed logs, but in the margins of official records, the fragmented memories of peripheral observers, and the stark, physical evidence left behind in their empty bedroom. Jonathan Mallory was 9 years old in 1836. Parish records from their time on the mainland describe him as a bright, inquisitive boy. A letter from his former schoolteacher, included in the initial investigation file, calls him a sensitive and imaginative child with a talent for drawing and a keen interest in the natural world. He was, by all accounts, a normal boy, perhaps a bit quieter than his peers, but in no way troubled. Emily Mallory was 6. The same parish records note her baptism and little else. She exists primarily in her parents' writings, a happy child, content with her dolls and the imaginary kingdoms she built in the tide pools. She was the light of the small family, a source of simple, uncomplicated joy. The last people to see the entire Mallory family alive and seemingly well were the crew of the supply boat Osprey, which made its final delivery of the season on October the 27th, 1836. The captain, a man named Jacob Foster, gave a brief deposition to the port authorities in January, after word of the family's disappearance had become common knowledge along the coast. His testimony was considered unremarkable at the time, but viewed through the lens of the parents' writings, it takes on a darker significance. An excerpt from the deposition of Jacob Foster reads, "We made landfall at Greyhaven near midday. The weather was turning. A storm was coming in from the northeast. Keeper Mallory was there to meet us, same as always. He was a steady man. We unloaded the supplies, flour, salt pork, lamp oil, and a few crates of personal goods from the mainland. His wife, Mrs. Mallory, came out of the house. She seemed distracted. Her eyes kept going to the sea, even when I was speaking to her. She looked pale. I assumed she was worried about the coming storm." Foster's description of Catherine aligns perfectly with the timing of her first letters about the strange song from the water. On the very day she was beginning to feel its pull, a visitor saw her as distracted and pale. But it is his description of the children that is most haunting. The deposition continues. The children were there, too. The little girl, Emily, she stayed close to her mother, holding onto her skirt. She did not say a word the entire time we were there, which was unusual. She was normally a very cheerful child who would ask us questions about our journey. The boy, Jonathan, was different. He was not on the landing with the others. He was standing farther up the rocks, much closer to the tower. He was just staring out at the water, at the shoals to the north. He never once looked at our boat. He was completely still, like a statue. I called out a greeting to him, but he gave no sign that he heard me. The keeper, Mr. Mallory, noticed me looking at his son. He said the boy had become a great admirer of the sea. There was an edge to his voice, though, a worry. As we cast off, I looked back. The keeper and his wife were heading back to the house, but the boy was still on the rocks, in the same spot, watching the water. This was October the 27th. One day, before Edwin Mallory would make the first unusual entry in his log about the strange vibrations in the stone. One day before Catherine would write to her sister about the compelling, sad music from the deep. Jonathan, it seems, was already listening. His stillness, his fixation on the water, it was not the idle daydreaming of a child. It was the focused attention of someone receiving a message. He was the first to fall silent, the first to truly answer the call. The most disturbing piece of physical evidence connected to the children remains the symbol scratched into the bedroom wall. For decades, they were dismissed as the nonsensical carvings of a disturbed child. But in the early 20th century, a copy of the symbols, sketched by Captain Brewer in the appendix of his official report, was examined by a professor of antiquities at Harvard University. The professor, Dr. Alistair Finch, noted a troubling resemblance between the Greyhaven symbols and certain pre-cuneiform glyphs found on Mesopotamian tablets, glyphs associated with ancient water deities of a particularly malevolent nature. From a letter by Dr. Alistair Finch to the Maine Historical Society, dated 1911, the patterns are not identical to any known script, but the structural motifs are highly suggestive. They possess what we call a recursive geometry, where patterns repeat within themselves, creating an effect of infinite depth. This is a common feature in symbolic systems designed to represent concepts that defy rational comprehension, such as eternity or cosmic chaos. In several ancient traditions, such symbols were not considered mere representations. They were believed to be conduits, doorways through which power could be channeled or influence exerted. To find such a complex and archaic symbology scratched into a wall in 19th century Maine is, to put it mildly, inexplicable. The child could not have invented this. He was copying something he had seen, either in a book or in his own mind. There were no such books at the Greyhaven Lighthouse. The Mallory's small library consisted of the Bible, Shakespeare, and a few volumes of nautical charts and almanacs. Jonathan was not copying something he had seen in a book. He was transcribing something he was being shown. The source was not ink and paper. It was whatever lurked in the whispering shoals he watched so intently from his window. The blood and broken fingernails found at the base of the wall attest to the furious, obsessive nature of his work. This was not a child's idle scratching. It was a compulsion, an act of desperate, painful creation. In his letter, Catherine wrote that she had seen the symbols in her dreams, and that Jonathan was giving them form. He was the artist for the family's shared nightmare. And what of Emily? In the shadow of her brother's terrifying transformation, the younger child all but disappears from the record. She is a ghost in the narrative, present only through the worried asides of her parents. Edwin's log mentions that she hid under her covers, afraid of the songs Jonathan sings. Catherine's letters speak of her clinging to her skirts, a silent, fearful child. But there is one piece of evidence, easily overlooked, that speaks directly to Emily's experience. It was the small cloth doll found lying face down on the floor of the main room by Captain Brewer's search party. The doll was entered into the official inventory of items recovered from the lighthouse and was stored in an evidence locker for years before being transferred to the archives of the Maine Historical Society, where it remains today. It is a simple thing, made of homespun linen and stuffed with raw wool, with button eyes and a mouth stitched in red thread. In the 1980s, a museum curator was preparing the doll for a new exhibit on maritime life when she noticed something odd. The doll's simple dress, a faded blue calico, was stiff in several places. Believing it to be water damage, she sent it for textile analysis. The results were unexpected. The stains were not from seawater. They were from wax. Specifically, the high-grade paraffin wax used to seal larder jars and weatherproof canvas. Furthermore, a microscopic analysis of the doll's head, near the button eyes and stitched mouth, revealed tiny, embedded particles of the same wax. The implication was as simple as it was horrifying. Someone, most likely Emily herself, had taken warm, soft wax and carefully sealed the doll's eyes and mouth. She was silencing her tiny companion, blinding it to what she was seeing and making it unable to speak of what she was hearing. It was the act of a terrified child trying to protect her one confidant from the encroaching horror that had consumed her family. She was creating a small zone of deafness and blindness in a world that had become too terrible to see or hear. This small, desperate act gives us our only glimpse into Emily's mind. While her brother was actively engaging with the presence, carving its language into the walls, Emily was trying to block it out. Her fear was not passive, it was active. She was fighting back in the only way a 6-year-old girl could. The untouched meal on the table becomes even more poignant in this light. The family did not just vanish. They were in the midst of a battle. Edwin was fighting with his faith and his reason. Catherine was fighting the pull of the song. Jonathan was succumbing, becoming a scribe for the darkness. And Emily, with her doll and her wax, was trying to build a fortress of silence. The final question, then, is what became of them? The official theory holds that they were swept away by a wave. But no bodies were ever recovered, despite the extensive currents in the area which usually return the drowned to shore. And it does not explain the state of the house, the unlatched door, the burning lantern. A more disturbing clue comes, once again, from the physical state of the children's bedroom. Captain Brewer's report notes the scratches on the wall and the blood on the floor. But an addendum to his report, written a week later after a follow-up interview, adds another detail he had initially considered unimportant. From the addendum to the report of Captain Elias Brewer. In response to further questioning, I wish to clarify the state of the children's sleeping quarters. There were 2 cots in the room. The one belonging to the girl, Emily, was undisturbed. The bedding was neat. The cot belonging to the boy, Jonathan, was in a state of disarray. The blankets were thrown to the floor. But most strangely, the mattress, which was a simple sack filled with straw, had been torn open at the foot of the bed. A great deal of the straw had been pulled out and scattered across the floorboards. At the time, I assumed this was simply part of the boy's general state of agitation. I did not consider it significant. But what if it was significant? Why would a boy in a state of terror or mania methodically empty his mattress onto the floor? It is an act with no obvious purpose, unless, of course, he was looking for something. Or, more disturbingly, unless he was trying to hide something. Years later, a local legend would arise among the fishermen of the coast. They claimed that the Mallory children had not been taken by the sea. They said that the sea had come for them, that something had risen from the Whispering Shoals, something that could pass through stone and wood, and had hidden itself in the straw of a child's bed, waiting for the family to gather for their final meal. This is, of course, folklore. There is no evidence for it, but it resonates with the final, terrible pieces of the puzzle. The open door, the meal uneaten, the family gone. The children of Greyhaven were not just victims of this tragedy. They were its epicenter. One was a prophet, the other a silent resistor, and their empty room, with its scarred walls and violated mattress, remains the most powerful and disturbing testimony to the last, unimaginable days of the Mallory family. To understand the fate of the Mallory family, it is not enough to examine their final, desperate writings. One must also look to the history of the rock upon which they lived and died. The islet officially named Greyhaven on 19th century nautical charts was, for generations prior, known by a different and more ominous name among the local fishermen and sailors. They called it the Cradle, and the treacherous, half-submerged labyrinth of rocks that surrounded it was known as the Whispering Shoals. These were not names born of affection. They were warnings, passed down in quiet tones in waterfront taverns and aboard ships navigating the fog-shrouded coast. Long before the lighthouse was ever conceived, the waters around the islet were considered cursed. Seasoned captains would plot their courses miles to the east, even in clear weather, to avoid the place. The reasons were rooted in a deep and persistent folklore, a collection of tales that spoke of the area's unnatural properties. The most common belief centered on the sound that gave the shoals their name. It was said that on still, quiet nights, especially when the fog was thick, a low, whispering sound would rise from the water. It was not the sound of wind or waves. It was described as something more complex, almost musical, a chorus of voices just below the threshold of understanding. Some sailors claimed to hear their own names called out on the mist. Others spoke of a sound like a lullaby, sung in a language that was not human. To hear the whisper was considered a terrible omen. Ships that strayed too close to the shoals were often lost, even when conditions were not particularly dangerous. They would be found wrecked upon the rocks, their hulls breached, with no clear explanation for the navigational error. A formal account of this phenomenon can be found in the ship's log of the revenue cutter Hamilton, dated 1821, more than a decade before the lighthouse was built. The cutter was responding to the wreck of a merchant brig, the Eleanor Dane, which had run aground on the shoals. An excerpt from the log of the cutter Hamilton, November 4th, 1821, reads, "At dawn, we located the wreck of the Eleanor Dane hard upon the northern rocks of the islet. The ship is a total loss, her back broken. We launched the longboat and found 3 survivors clinging to the mast. They were alive, but in a strange state. Their bodies were numb with cold, but their minds seemed colder still. They did not speak. Their eyes were wide and vacant. One of them, the first mate, was humming a low, repetitive tune. He hummed this same tune without pause for the entire journey back to Portland. When asked what happened, the captain, a man of good repute, could only say that they had been sung onto the rocks. He said a beautiful, sad song had come from the water, and he had steered toward it, believing it was a sign of a safe harbor." The captain's words were dismissed as the delirious ramblings of a man who had suffered a great trauma. But his story was not unique. It was merely the first to be officially recorded. The Whispering Shoals did not just wreck ships, they seemed to lure them to their doom. This dark reputation extends even further back, beyond the memory of the European settlers, into the traditions of the Mi'kmaq people who had fished and lived along this coast for centuries. They had a name for the islet, a name that translated roughly to the Rock of the Lost Children. They never camped there, and their oral traditions contain stark warnings against it. A valuable, if biased, insight into these beliefs comes from the journal of a French Jesuit missionary, Father Laurent Dubreuil, who worked in the region in the mid-18th century. His journal, intended to document the customs of the native people for his superiors in Quebec, unintentionally preserved a piece of the folklore that would become terrifyingly relevant a century later. From the journal of Father Laurent Dubreuil, circa 1748, the savages have a most peculiar and godless superstition regarding a small, barren island of rock several miles from the coast. They will not land upon it, nor will they fish in the waters that surround it, which they claim are the domain of spirits they call the ones who were taken. Their legend states that these were once people of the land in a time before memory, but a great sorrow or crime, the details of which are now lost, caused the sea to claim them. They were not drowned in the Christian sense. They were changed. They were reshaped by the cold and the dark and the immense pressure of the deep water. They lost their legs, their arms, their voices as we know them. Father Laurent's account continues, his tone a mixture of fascination and pious disapproval. They believe these spirits are filled with a profound loneliness and a desperate longing for the world of air and light they have lost. They cannot return, but they can call to those on the surface. They sing from the deep, a song of terrible sadness that can break a man's will and lead him to the water. They are envious of the living, and most of all, they are envious of children, who remind them of the families they no longer have. Their greatest desire is to gather new children to themselves, to pull them down into their cold, silent world. The savages draw strange, angular symbols on pieces of driftwood and cast them into the sea as offerings, hoping to placate these hungry spirits. It is a dark and pagan fancy, but one they hold with absolute conviction. The parallels to the Mallory case are impossible to ignore. A song of terrible sadness that draws people to the water, spirits envious of families and children. The detail about the strange, angular symbols is perhaps the most chilling of all. Father Laurent, with no knowledge of the future, had documented the very mythology that seemed to play out, note for note, in the final days at Greyhaven. The decision to build a lighthouse on this particular islet, then, seems a profound act of either ignorance or arrogance. Port records from the early 1830s show a heated debate over the location. Several experienced captains argued against it, citing the place's ill reputation and the unstable nature of the rock itself. But the increasing number of wrecks on the shoals demanded action. The official position of the lighthouse service was that a powerful, modern light, a symbol of reason and progress, would banish the shadows of local superstition and make the passage safe. They believed they could impose order on a place that had only ever known chaos. They saw a dangerous rock in need of a light. They failed to consider that the danger was not the rock itself, but something that lived within or beneath it. The lighthouse was not a fortress against the darkness. It was an anchor, a permanent, year-round human presence tethered directly to a place the Mi'kmaq had known to avoid for 1,000 years. It gave the ones who were taken a constant, unwavering focus for their longing. It gave them the Mallory family. After the discovery of Father Laurent's journal by a regional historian in the 1920s, a new theory began to form, one that connected the ancient folklore to the physical evidence. The historian cross-referenced the Jesuits' description of the Mi'kmaq pictographs with the sketch Captain Brewer had made of the symbols on Jonathan Mallory's bedroom wall. The similarity was undeniable. The interlocking spirals, the sharp, unnatural angles, they were the same. The academic from Harvard, Dr. Finch, had been both right and wrong. The symbols were indeed ancient, but their origin was not thousands of miles away in Mesopotamia. It was local. It was the symbolic language of the very entity that haunted the shoals. Jonathan Mallory was not carving nonsense. He was not channeling a distant, foreign demon. He was learning the native tongue of the horror that lived just outside his window. The Whispering Shoals were not just a place. They were a presence. The name Greyhaven was a thin veneer of modernity plastered over a place with a much older and darker name. The Mallorys were not the first to hear the song from the deep. They were simply the first who could not escape it. They were trapped on the rock, in a house built to keep the storms out, never realizing that the greatest threat was the one that could whisper its way through solid stone. The Greyhaven Lighthouse was a monument to the unyielding rationalism of its time. It was conceived by men of science and commerce who believed that stone, iron, and a sufficiently powerful light could conquer any darkness, whether it be the physical darkness of the sea or the superstitious darkness of the human mind. The official records of its construction, housed in the Federal Archives, are a testament to this conviction. They are filled with engineering schematics, cost ledgers, and reports on the tensile strength of mortar. There is no room in these documents for folklore, for whispers, or for the ancient history of the rock itself. The chief architect was a man named Silas Blackwood, a respected engineer from Boston known for his pragmatic and innovative designs. His plans for Greyhaven were a model of efficiency and durability. The tower was to be a tapered cylinder of solid granite blocks, quarried from the mainland and painstakingly ferried to the islet. Its foundation would be sunk 10 feet into the island's core, a granite pin driven into a granite fist, designed to withstand the most ferocious Atlantic storms for a century or more. Blackwood saw the project not as an intrusion into a wild space, but as an imposition of order, a triumph of human will over the chaotic indifference of nature. Construction began in the spring of 1832 and lasted nearly 2 full years. It was a brutal, arduous undertaking. The islet offered no natural harbor, forcing the construction crews to build a temporary and frequently damaged stone jetty to offload their materials. They worked in punishing conditions, battered by wind and salt spray, living in crude wooden barracks erected on the only patch of relatively flat ground. The work was slow, dangerous, and demoralizing. The official construction log, kept by the site foreman, a man named Cormac O'Connell, records 3 serious injuries and 1 fatality during the project. A stonemason lost 3 fingers to a slipping block. A rigger fell from the scaffolding, shattering his leg. A laborer was washed off the jetty by a rogue wave and was never seen again. These events, while tragic, were not considered unusual for a project of this scale and difficulty. They were logged as unfortunate, but expected, costs of progress. Yet, years later, after the Mallory family disappeared, investigators revisited the construction period, seeking any clue or precedent for the strange events. They interviewed a handful of the surviving laborers. Their depositions, taken in 1837, paint a picture that the official log completely omits. They speak not of industrial accidents, but of a place that felt actively hostile to their presence. Cormac O'Connell, the foreman, was interviewed first. He was a gruff, no-nonsense man who had little patience for what he called sailors' fantasies. His testimony is grounded in the practical, but even he could not deny the strange character of the place. An excerpt from the deposition of Cormac O'Connell reads, "It was a cursed job from the start. The rock itself was the main problem. It was harder than any granite I've worked with, dulling our tools at an astonishing rate. But it was also strangely porous, full of cracks and fissures. When the tide came in, the whole island would seem to hum. It was a low, vibrating sound, like a great church organ playing a single deep note. The men complained of it, said it got into their bones, made their teeth ache. I told them it was just water moving through sea caves beneath our feet. Nothing more." O'Connell was pressed by the investigators about other sounds, about the whispers that local legend described. Whispers, aye, you'd hear things. When the wind blew through the unfinished stonework of the tower, it would howl and moan. Sometimes, when the fog was thick, a man might think he heard his name called. It's the acoustics of the place, a hollow tower on a rock in the middle of the sea. It plays tricks on the ear. The men were spooked, that's all. They were isolated, working hard, and they let the old stories get into their heads. I had to send 2 men back to the mainland for fighting. They were at each other's throats over nothing. Their nerves were just worn raw by the constant noise and the loneliness. O'Connell's account is one of rational explanations for unnerving phenomena, but the testimony of another builder, a stonemason named Finian Hale, offers a far more disturbing perspective. Hale was a quiet religious man who had worked on the tower for the first year of its construction. He quit the job abruptly in the summer of 1833, forfeiting a significant portion of his pay. He was reluctant to speak of his experiences, and his deposition is filled with long, tense pauses. From the deposition of Finian Hale: "It was not the wind. I have worked in high places my whole life. I know the sounds the wind makes. This was different. It was a voice, many voices. They came from the stone. When you laid your hands on the blocks we were setting, you could feel them, a vibration. And in that vibration, there were words. Not clear words, not English. It was a murmuring, a complaining sound, like people woken from a long sleep who were angry at the disturbance." Hale's testimony grows more specific and more fearful. At night, in the barracks, it was worse. The humming from the rock would come up through the floorboards. It made it hard to sleep. And in that half-sleep, you would hear it more clearly, a sort of singing. It was a sad sound. It made you feel a profound sense of loss, a grief for something you couldn't remember. Men would wake up weeping and not know why. Cormac said it was bad drink and exhaustion. It was not. It was the island. It was grieving, and it was making us grieve with it. The investigators asked Hale why he ultimately left the project. His answer was quiet and firm. "One evening, near dusk, I was working alone on the upper course of the tower. I dropped a trowel. It fell to the rocks below. I leaned over the edge to see where it had gone, and the humming stopped. For the first time in a year, there was total silence, and in that silence, a single, clear voice spoke right beside my ear. It was a woman's voice. It said my name, Finian. There was no one there. I was 60 feet in the air. I nearly fell from the shock. I packed my tools that night and took the next boat back to shore. I told Cormac my mother was ill. I did not have a mother. She had been dead for 10 years. I would rather die a liar than spend another night on that rock. The place is not empty. It is full of a cold, sad hunger." Hale's testimony was dismissed at the time as the product of a superstitious mind. But decades later, in the light of modern acoustic science, a new and chilling theory emerged. In the 1950s, a marine geology survey of the coastline mapped the seabed around the former lighthouse site. They discovered that the islet of Greyhaven was not a solid piece of rock. It was the exposed peak of a much larger, deeply eroded volcanic cone, honeycombed with a vast and complex network of underwater caves and tunnels. An acoustic engineer studying these maps proposed a startling hypothesis. The islet was, in effect, a naturally formed and gigantic aeolian harp. As the tides rose and fell, they would force massive quantities of water and trapped air through this subterranean labyrinth at high pressure. This movement would create a powerful, low-frequency resonance, the deep, vibrating hum that the builders described. Furthermore, as the air was forced through smaller fissures and vents in the rock, it would create a wide range of higher frequency sounds, a complex, layered acoustic effect that could easily be perceived by the human ear as whispering, murmuring, or even singing. The Greyhaven Lighthouse Tower, a hollow, cylindrical structure built directly on top of this instrument, would have acted as a massive resonance chamber, amplifying these sounds and channeling them up through its stone walls. The lighthouse was not just a house built on haunted ground. The house itself was an active part of the haunting. It was a giant stone ear pressed firmly against the mouth of the Whispering Shoals. The Mallory family, unlike the construction crew, did not leave. They lived inside the instrument day and night for 3 years. They were subjected to a constant, subliminal acoustic assault. The unending, low-frequency vibrations would have had a profound and cumulative effect on their minds, inducing states of anxiety, depression, and heightened suggestibility. The higher frequency whispers would have become a constant, maddening presence in their lives. Edwin Mallory's log, Catherine's letters, They are the records of minds being systematically broken down not by isolation, but by a scientifically explainable, yet nonetheless malevolent, environmental phenomenon. The song from the deep was real. The voices in the walls were real. The lighthouse that was built to be a beacon of clarity had instead become a machine for generating madness, perfectly designed to tune its inhabitants to the terrible frequency of the rock's ancient sorrow. The final, horrifying piece of this puzzle was discovered by a researcher in the Boston Architectural Archives in 1974. She was examining the original hand-drawn schematics for the Greyhaven Lighthouse, signed by Silas Blackwood himself. Tucked away in the corner of the detailed cross-section of the foundation, almost invisible against the intricate lines of the drawing, was a tiny, faint annotation in pencil. It was clear from the pressure and the script that it was a private note, something Blackwood had added for himself, not intended for the final blueprints. The note read, "Acoustic anomaly in foundation rock, subsonic resonance at tidal influx, a constant hum, could induce melancholia or auditory hallucination in a permanent occupant. The rock itself seems to moan." Silas Blackwood, the man of reason and science, had known. He had recognized the danger, not as a supernatural curse, but as a tangible, physical threat to the sanity of any future keeper. He had noted it, and then he, or someone after him, had chosen to ignore it. The warning was buried, and the Mallory family was sent to live in a house that was designed to listen to the whispers of the sea. A house that would not rest until its inhabitants learned to sing along. The narrative of the Mallory family's final days must be pieced together from the shattered fragments of evidence left behind. There is no single, coherent account. There is only Edwin Mallory's logbook, with its torn-out page and its final, desperate scrawl, the chilling echoes in Catherine's letters, the meteorological data of the Coast Guard, and the silent, physical testimony of the abandoned lighthouse itself. From these disparate sources, a reconstruction of the family's last known hours can be attempted. It is a timeline of escalating horror, culminating in an act that defies rational explanation. The last dated entry in Edwin's log is November the 30th, 1836. It is a frantic, terrified description of his son's self-mutilation and his wife's psychological transformation. He writes, "The sea is not the sea. It is a door, and it is opening." Following this entry is the page filled with the frenzied, overlapping symbols, and then the ragged stub of the torn-out page. Whatever happened on December the 1st was so terrible, so conclusive, that it had to be both recorded and then violently erased from the record. We can surmise that this was the day the entity, the presence in the water, finally breached the family's defenses. It had been whispering through the stones, singing in their dreams, and turning their children into its conduits. The events of December the 1st were likely the culmination of this siege. Perhaps this was the day Catherine, as described in her last letter, fully embraced the call, no longer fighting the other voice inside her. Perhaps this was the day Jonathan's silent communion with the water became a physical invitation. The torn page represents a moment of unbearable truth, an event so monstrous that Edwin recorded it in a final act of dutiful record-keeping, only to then realize that such a truth could not be allowed to exist on paper. Following the missing page are 3 blank pages. 3 days of silence, December the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. What happened on these days? Did Edwin Mallory simply stop writing, his will to document finally broken? Or did nothing happen? Was it a period of quiet, unnerving calm after the storm of December the 1st? This is perhaps the more terrifying possibility. A silence in which the family waited, transformed, and resigned for a final signal. During this period, on December the 3rd, the merchant vessel Sea Serpent passed Greyhaven and noted in its log that the light seemed weak, as if sputtering. This is a crucial detail. It suggests that Edwin was still performing his duties, but just barely. His focus was fractured. The light, the symbol of his reason and his responsibility to the outside world, was failing. He was still alive, still inside the tower, but his grip was slipping. The final entry in the Greyhaven logbook has no date. It is scrawled at the very top of a fresh page, after the 3 blank ones. It is written in a hand so shaky and degraded that it is barely recognizable as Edwin Mallory's. The letters are thin and spidery, the ink pale, as if the quill was nearly dry. It is a single, cryptic sentence. The sentence reads, "The sea is not the sea. It wants us back." For years, this was believed to be the end of the message. But in the 1990s, a forensic document analyst subjected a high-resolution photograph of the page to digital enhancement. The process revealed fainter markings on the page, indentations made by the quill when there was no ink left on its nib. The analyst was able to reconstruct 3 additional words, scratched into the paper after the ink ran out. The full final entry, as we now understand it, reads, "The sea is not the sea. It wants us back. My own dear. My own dear." It is a phrase of profound, heartbreaking affection. It is not the raving of a madman. It is the lament of a husband and a father. It transforms the sentence from a statement of cosmic horror into a personal surrender. He is not just describing a malevolent force. He is describing the loss of his family to it. They have been claimed, and he, in his final moment of clarity, is acknowledging his defeat. My own dear refers to Catherine, to Jonathan, to Emily. They are no longer his. They belong to the sea. So, what happened on that final night, likely December the 4th or 5th? We can reconstruct a possible sequence of events. The family gathers for their evening meal. The plates are laid. The food is served. The single lantern on the table is lit against the gathering dusk. But they do not eat. Something interrupts them. It is not a sound from outside anymore. It is a command from within. Catherine stands up from the table, her chair scraping against the stone floor. Her shawl slips from her shoulders. Her face is calm, her eyes distant, fixed on the door that leads out into the cold night. She is humming her tuneless, discordant melody. Jonathan rises with her, his movements stiff and unnatural. His bandaged hands hang at his sides. He, too, is listening to a music no one else can hear. Little Emily, her doll left forgotten on the floor, takes her mother's hand. She is no longer fighting. There is no more wax to seal the eyes and ears of the world. She has surrendered. Edwin Mallory watches them. He is the last bastion of the old world, the world of reason and family and love. He sees his wife and children not as the people who he knows, but as vessels for something alien and ancient. The fight has gone out of him. The biblical verses he clung to have offered no protection. The barred door has proven useless against a threat that travels on sound and whispers through stone. He does not try to stop them. He knows it is useless. Catherine walks to the heavy oak door and unlatches it. A wave of cold, briny air fills the room, causing the lantern on the table to flicker. She does not look back. She steps out into the darkness, leading her children towards the sound of the surf, towards the whispering shoals, towards their new family. Edwin remains at the table. For a long moment, there is only the sound of the wind and the sea, and the terrible, echoing silence in the house. He is now truly alone. He walks to his desk, to the logbook, the final repository of his identity as a keeper and a man. He picks up the quill. His hand is trembling so violently he can barely form the letters. He dips the quill in the inkwell and writes his final, terrible truth. The sea is not the sea. It wants us back. The ink runs dry, but his grief, his love, his final act of naming the lost compels him to scratch the last 3 words into the page. My own dear. Then he puts down the quill. His duty is done. The record is complete. What does he do next? The state of the lighthouse gives us our final, chilling clue. He does not blow out the lantern on the table. He leaves it burning, a small, weak beacon in an empty house, a sign for the outside world that something has gone terribly wrong. Then he walks to the base of the tower and begins to climb the winding iron staircase. He ascends through the darkness, his footsteps echoing in the hollow cylinder. He climbs past the small windows that show only the black, churning water below. He does not stop until he reaches the lamp room at the very top. The great Fresnel lens stands before him, a giant, multifaceted eye waiting for its fire. The mechanism is wound, the oil reservoirs are full. All it needs is a lit match. It is his sacred duty, the one thing he has dedicated his life to for the past 3 years, to light the lamp, to push back the darkness, to keep others safe. And he does not do it. This final act of inaction is perhaps the most horrifying part of the entire tragedy. Edwin Mallory, the dutiful keeper, chooses to let his light go out. Why? Was it an act of ultimate despair? A final admission that no light could possibly stand against such a darkness? Or was it something else? Was it an act of allegiance? By letting the light go dark, he is no longer warning ships away from the shoals. He is inviting them in. He is siding with the entity that has taken his family. He has surrendered not just his life, but his very soul. He has become a keeper of a different kind of light now, the dark, hungry light of the sea itself. He does not return to the house. He does not throw himself from the rocks. The evidence suggests a simpler and far more terrifying departure. After leaving the lamp room in darkness, he descends the stairs, walks out the unlatched door, and follows his family down to the water's edge. He does not enter the water to drown. He enters the water to go home. He walks into the cold, gray embrace of the Atlantic, not as a man committing suicide, but as a man accepting an invitation, rejoining the family that has gone on before him. The sea did not take them in a storm. They gave themselves to it, willingly, one by one, leaving behind only an empty house, a cold meal, and a book filled with the story of their terrible, methodical seduction. In the spring of 1837, the United States Lighthouse Service officially decommissioned the Greyhaven Light. It had been operational for less than 4 years. The official report cited the extreme difficulty of manning such an isolated and hazardous post, but the truth was far simpler. No one would take the job. The story of the Mallory family had spread like a fever along the coast, a dark piece of folklore whispered in taverns and sailors' messes from Portland to Boston. Keepers with families refused to even consider the post, and single men, who might have otherwise been tempted by the good pay, would just shake their heads and say that some rocks were best left to the sea. The Greyhaven Lighthouse was an acknowledged failure, an emblem of a horror that no amount of official paperwork could erase. A salvage crew was sent in the summer of that year to retrieve the expensive Fresnel lens and the clockwork mechanism. They were a grim, silent crew who worked quickly and spoke only when necessary. Their log from the 2-day operation is brief, but it contains one telling entry. The captain notes that his men refused to remain on the islet after dark, choosing instead to sleep on the cramped deck of their boat anchored 100 yards offshore, despite a heavy swell. He writes that they were spooked by a persistent and unsettling hum that seemed to rise from the very stones of the island as the sun went down. For the next several decades, the tower stood empty, a hollow stone sentinel against the sky. Its windows were smashed by winter storms, its iron door rusted from its hinges, and its granite walls became streaked with green and black lichen. The sea, which had claimed the family, now began the slow, patient work of claiming the house they had left behind. In 1872, a great winter hurricane, the same one that sank 2 whaling ships off Nantucket, finally broke the tower's spine. The entire lantern room and the top 30 feet of the structure were torn away and cast into the churning water below. What remained was a jagged, ruined stump, a monument to a forgotten tragedy. But the story did not die. It simply went quiet, retreating into the realm of local legend. Sailors navigating the coast on moonless nights swore they could still see a light at Greyhaven. It was not the powerful, sweeping beam of a Fresnel lens. It was a small, weak, flickering light, like a single candle or a child's hand lantern, appearing for a moment in a window that no longer existed, then vanishing into the darkness. Others, when the wind was right, claimed to hear a faint, sad music carried across the water from the direction of the ruined tower. It was a sound, they said, that made the heart ache with a cold and nameless sorrow. In the 20th century, the Greyhaven mystery became a subject of renewed interest for historians and paranormal investigators. The Mallory logbook and Catherine's water-damaged letters, long dormant in state archives, were re-examined. The story was no longer just folklore. It was a historical case study, a puzzle of madness, isolation, and unexplained phenomena. Several attempts were made to conduct serious archaeological and geological surveys of the site. None were successful. A team from a New England university planned a comprehensive excavation of the lighthouse foundation in 1958. Their expedition was plagued by a series of bizarre and unfortunate events. A sudden, unseasonable storm damaged their boat on the journey out. Their sensitive measuring equipment malfunctioned without explanation. 2 members of the team became violently ill with a fever that vanished the moment they returned to the mainland. They abandoned the project after only 3 days, their official report citing unforeseen logistical and environmental challenges. In the 1980s, with the advent of more sophisticated technology, a marine research vessel attempted to create a detailed sonar map of the seabed and the cave systems beneath the islet. The data they collected only deepened the mystery. They confirmed the existence of a vast, labyrinthine network of underwater tunnels, providing a scientific basis for the strange acoustics reported by the lighthouse builders. But the sonar also returned a series of anomalies for which the scientists had no explanation. In certain deep pockets directly beneath the islet's foundation, the sonar signals did not bounce back. They were simply absorbed. These acoustic dead zones were like holes in the soundscape, places of absolute, unnatural silence. Furthermore, the ship's sensitive hydrophones, designed to record the sounds of marine life, picked up a persistent, low-frequency signal emanating from the area. It was not the song of any known whale or the geological hum of shifting rock. It was a complex, layered signal with a strange, repeating mathematical pattern. In their final report, the lead oceanographer wrote, with what seems to be a profound sense of scientific unease, that the signal was structurally indistinguishable from a crude and highly distorted form of communication. Today, the artifacts of the Mallory family reside in a climate-controlled vault in the Maine State Archives. The logbook sits in a sealed case, its final, desperate entry a permanent, silent scream. Catherine's letters are preserved under glass, her faded words a testament to a mother's terror. And in a small, separate box rests the smooth, dark stone that Edwin sent to Eleanor Vance, the stone etched with a strange, angular symbol. Curators who have handled the box have sometimes reported a sudden, inexplicable drop in the room's temperature, or the feeling of a profound and overwhelming sadness that passes as quickly as it comes. It is still called the key, though no one knows what lock it might open. The ruins of the lighthouse are now barely visible from the sea, just a few jagged teeth of granite rising from the waves. The island is a designated bird sanctuary, though sailors note that the gulls and terns seem to avoid the place, preferring to nest on the surrounding rocks. The water is still cold, the fog is still thick, and the old stories are still told. The mystery of what truly happened to the Mallory family is no closer to being solved now than it was in 1836. Perhaps there is no solution to be found. Perhaps it is not a story with an ending. The official record will forever state that they were lost at sea. But the other records, the whispers and the warnings, the sonar maps and the cold spots in the archives, suggest something else. They suggest that the Mallory family was not lost at all. They were found, they were called, and they answered. And the light that sailors sometimes see is not a memory of the tower that once stood. It is a sign that the house is still occupied. For in the cold, silent deep off Greyhaven, a family is a thing that can grow.